Он говорить будет вот в этот микрофон. Всем добрый вечер. Спасибо вам большое, что вы пришли на нашу лекцию. Меня зовут Эльмира, я координатор магистерской программы Advanced Urban Design, которую мы реализуем вместе с Институтом Стрелка и Высшей школой урбанистики. Сегодня у нас закрывающее мероприятие из серии лекций наших преподавателей, которые будут преподавать на нашей магистерской программе. И мы пригласили одного из основных преподавателей Маркуса Шаефера, который является архитектором, исследователем, урбанистом, первым директором research студии AMO, которая была организована Рэмом Колхасом. И сейчас он директор студии Markus Schaefer and Hosoya Architects в Швейцарии. Также он был куратором швейцарского павильона на Венецианской биеннале 2014 года. То есть это очень человек, который держит руку на пульсе всего происходящего сегодня в мире урбанистики, архитектуры и развития городов. И Маркус будет представлять большой курс на программе по современной теории городского проектирования. И сегодня он расскажет немножко в своей лекции о том, что с городами делает глобализация. So thank you very much for your coming. I just introduced all your big achievements. Please enjoy the lecture, and I think after that we'll have a lot of questions, Q&As. Thank you.
Somehow I'm not on yet. Is that better? No. Like now? No. The wrong channel. Maybe.
Может быть, с обычным микрофоном?
Okay, give me. Fine, wonderful. So perfect. It's a pleasure to be here. Strelka is a myth. I'm happy I can be part of it, not only now but also in the fall, teaching here. Of course, Moscow is also a myth. I have never been here. It's all the more exciting to be here the first time. This will not be a political lecture, but in the end it will be all about politics. It will be all about who we are and how we want to be together, how we want to live together, and how we as architects and urbanists are trying to answer this particular question. Originally, I'm actually trained as a scientist, and I love the ability of science to compress facts and make them easy to understand, make them easy to manipulate. But then I decided to become an architect because I also loved the richness of reality and the sensuousness of reality. And somehow this image is a perfect combination of both. It's a beautiful object, almost a piece of art. At the same time, it's an achievement of science. It's Yuri Gagarin's space capsule with which he went to space about almost 50 years ago. And it was an unbelievable pleasure to actually try it out. Of course, only on the ground. I would not have ever dared to use it in reality. But it is unbelievably simple, and yet it worked. And of course it worked because of these types of people. This is a person in the museum who actually let me in. He is a lunokhod operator, worked at Baikonur, and basically maneuvered the probes on the moon, the first probes, the first moving things which actually ever traveled on the moon. And of course this is very much the promise of science, that people with good ideas somehow with technology are able to do something which completely transcends our existence on Earth. And what we now need to do is to take this ability and put it together with what we need as humans in order to make a future which is actually livable and enjoyable. This future will be not so easy because we live in a planet which has changed immensely since Yuri Gagarin for the very first time ever looked onto this planet. Since Yuri Gagarin's flight and view of this image, the Earth's population doubled from about 3 billion people to almost 7 billion people right now. In only about 50 years, the Earth population doubled. This is immense. Nobody knows what that exactly means. This is one of the answers done by an American economist, by Thomas L. Friedman. He wrote the book Hot, Flat and Crowded, projecting our civilization into the future. Hot, we know, climate change is in some ways real. Crowded, we know. In fact, we have double the population than what Yuri Gagarin saw on this planet. But flat might be a bit wrong. Flat means globalization allows us to travel everywhere, to see everything, to exchange thoughts very easily, to consume goods from all over the planet. But at the same time, the world is not really actually flat. The world is in many ways extremely spiky. It's very unevenly distributed. For example, in Moscow, you have a huge density of people, a huge density of talent, of know-how, of ability, of economy, of economic potential, of jobs, of opportunities all of you have in the future. But if you move just a bit outside of Moscow, that picture changes a lot. There are huge areas in this country which have a very different outlook on the future. So the world is extremely spiky. It is not fair. When you look at all of the cities in the world, then they are distributed like you see here. It's a very typical distribution. It's called Zipf law. It basically means there are a few big cities, a few very large cities, there are some smaller cities, and there is a huge amount of very small cities. This type of distribution is very normal for things when exchange happens freely. It's the same thing with rich people. There are very few very rich people. There are some people who have some money, but there's a huge amount of people who have very little. So this type of distribution is a normal distribution when a system has no boundaries, right? When things can't just grow, they grow like this, that there are few who have a lot and a lot who have little. There is a law behind it, a scientific law, which is the law of proportional growth, which is extremely simple. It means that people who have a lot will get more. Cities who are big will get bigger more easily. Imagine you have 100 people who have exactly the same capabilities, the exact same amount of strength, and you let them start to compete. Right? Exact same starting point. At some point, one of these people will be a little bit better, right? Just a little bit. Maybe it's an accident. And then it's easier for him to get even more better. And then he starts to tell other people, hey, why don't you help me? And then he gets even more powerful, and so on and so on. So when you have an equally distributed, exactly the same type of persons, and you just let the system roll without any checks and balances, there will be inequality at the end, right? That's not good or bad. That's almost like mathematics. It's just a fact. And that means also that there are consequences of this fact that chances are unequally distributed. There are, for example, patents, so the growth of science, the growth of innovation and so on, which is also extremely unequally distributed. You have Asia is very visible, America is very, very visible, Europe is visible, Moscow is still a big peak, but everywhere else you have almost no patent application. When you look at wealth, for example, housing wealth in the UK, then you see the same thing, that There are some hotspots, but of course, the UK is organized one huge city, very similar to Russia. It's organized around London. All the wealth is concentrated in London. And when you zoom in and look even more precisely at this city, you will see that this wealth is not even equally spread in London. It is very much concentrated in the center and certain sub-centers, right? So cities are inherently organisms which generate inequality, right? They give everybody access to chances, that's true, but they generate difference. And this difference might be good or bad, but it's a fact we need to deal with. And dealing with this fact intelligently, that's called politics. Today we are not so good at doing this well. That's why we have this type of distribution of wealth. So what you see here is always 1/5 of the global population. So this is the lowest fifth, second lowest fifth, third, fourth, and the top 1/5 of the world's population. And the red area is the distribution of wealth. It is true that modernity lifted a lot of people out of poverty, that's true. But on the other hand, the price we had to pay for this is that some people, again like in Zipf law, like we saw this before, some people got a lot more rich than the people who just got a bit better. And getting better is also not always so fair, because if you were living in a society which didn't have a real economy but somehow had a good culture, being forced upon you an economy is not always the best thing, right? So this whole graph and this whole idea that modernity lifted a lot of people out of poverty, we need to look at with a bit of a question mark. So when you look at the globe now, then you can describe it like this, with this global city system behind it. And also in this city system, you see that there are some peaks of globalization in red, New York and London, for example. So the more red a city is colored, the more global it is, the more global connection it has, the more global capital is flowing in it. And the whiter the square is, the fewer the global links are, the less global capital is flowing in. So we have a kind of a global downtown and a global uptown or a global periphery, which you see here, for example, in India. And in terms of population, this is not always the same thing. So the bigger the square, the bigger the population of a particular area. So you have New York is very large, Tokyo, Yokohama is a gigantic, huge city, it's the biggest city agglomeration in the world. Mexico City is very large. So you have a lot of cities which, however, in their outlook in terms of global relationships they have, global capital they can access, they're also very different, right? So while modernity allowed us to have increasingly materially better lives, it also generates, like a kind of a machine, like a kind of an algorithm, it generates inequality on many levels. Per city, it generates inequality, that's the idea of London. Per nation, it generates inequality, that's what we saw in England. And on the globe, it generates inequality, that we see in this image here. What of course is driving all of this, like what's the machinery behind it? Why is that? What's driving all of this is of course this immense spike in human population, this huge mass of people which is now living on the planet. And we have an astonishing small experience with these many people, because what you see down here, this line here, is biological generations, 25 years, me and my son. What you see here is oral history, my grandfather and my son, 75 years apart. And with only about 30 people, you are at the birth of Christ, right? This urban system and this growth of population which we are currently witnessing is something we have immensely little experience with, because everything happens incredibly fast. Now, why? Like, what is this? Like, why is this system moving so fast? What's behind this? And my hypothesis, of course, is, it's not mine, I mean, it's a kind of a logical conclusion, is that cities, in a comprehensive sense, cities not just as architecture, but cities as a kind of a reactor, as a kind of machine, is what is behind this immense change and transformation. So we need to ask the question, what are cities? What are they actually? What kind of animal is a city? Right? How does it function? Is it more like a plant? Is it more like a mammal? What is a city? So we go back to this system of today, this global urban system, and we turn the clock back, right? We make a thought experiment. We just turn the clock back and think, what happens if we turn the movie backwards, if we run the movie backwards? What are the steps and where do we end up? So these are the 10 largest cities today, equally distributed. Globalization ran its course. We have the United States, we have Latin America with one big city, we have Asia, and of course also the Middle East. In the 1950s, just after the Second World War, it looked like this. The US was not yet so equally populated, only the East Coast cities were big. We had here still Rhine-Ruhr as a large city. Moscow was still one of the 10 largest cities, and we had here Calcutta. Around 1900, so we are now 116 years back, around 1900 it looked like this. We had here St. Petersburg, was actually bigger than Moscow. We had Manchester, right, the city where industrialization started, was still very large. We had Vienna, was important, of course, the Hungarian, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we had here Philadelphia, New York, Chicago. Then when you again go back to the 1800s, there the US and Latin America was populated, but it was not important yet, right? It now goes back. We had here China, immensely important. This was the end of the big Chinese empire, an incredible power which in the 1800s was in decline, being beaten by the colonial Europeans. And we had here Constantinople still, today Turkey of course, London, Paris, and interestingly enough Naples. And then 1500, so Middle Ages. China being immensely important at the height of its civilization, Constantinople, Cairo, Paris being visible, but Europe still a fairly dark place, not so much happened. The Romans disappeared, Europe was in medieval stupidity somehow. Then 1000 after Christ, Cordoba, Constantinople, Kaifeng, Kyoto, Angkor was there. And now 100 AD we had Rome, Carthago, Smyrna, Baghdad. We had here the Chinese cities, an important Indian city, Persian city. 1200 before Christ to 100 AD, sort of the end of the Bronze Age. We have here Antioch, Babylon, Carthago, Rome, Athens. Here, 3000 before Christ. It starts to compress, right? We're going to the origin of this urban machine, right? We're going to where it all started, which is, of course, in the Mesopotamian area with the two river area here in today's Iraq with Uruk, Akkad, Ur, cities like that. And if we were to go even more back, we would go to a place like this, which was settled around 8,000 years before today. This is one of the first ritual sites. What you have to imagine is that all of these hills, it's in Anatolia in today's Turkey, all of these hills were still green. There were antelopes running around, big wild pigs were running around, and there was a group of early settlers which were sitting around these stones which were about this big, which had images of pigs and antelopes on it. And around this place, these people were sitting, they were drinking the very first beer which was ever brewed by people, right? That's how we started to work with wheat, basically, how we domesticated wheat. So we drank the first beer, we were thinking about the past, talking about the future, looking out into the green hills. And in some way, between 8,000 before today to about 4,000 before today, 3,000 before today, the shift from something like this to something like that happened, right? Where all of a sudden, the early tools which we had, so domesticated wheat, which we needed to drink beer to become a bit high and have a good time together, the pigs which we were catching and started to domesticate, the fruit trees which we were gathering, and the ideas and stories about settling together and toiling the land, all of this came together to allow us humans to make these types of cities organized around a temple. And the temple of the early Babylonian and the Mesopotamian cities was the sacred legitimation of the city, so you never questioned the temple, because the temple basically was a very large redistribution institution. So it was the place where you went to get a job, right? You went there to get your bag of wheat, and with this wheat you could feed your family. And all of that was sanctioned, of course, by religion. And what is even more amazing, which freaks me out completely, I'm completely fascinated by it, that if you go only 60,000 years back, right, so we now were, with this Göbekli Tepe, so this first ritual site, we were about 8,000 to 10,000 before today. At this moment here, 60,000 before today, there was some group of human beings, and estimates by scientists say that it's maybe 500 to 5,000 people, so very, very few. You can see that in the genetics of today's people. These very few people, they traveled across the Red Sea and started to settle the globe. And this very small group of early people had one amazing thing they started with. And this amazing thing was language, a symbolic culture, right? The ability to talk to each other, the ability to plan, to anticipate, and in the end, the ability to take reality, abstract it into symbols, manipulate it, make a plan with it, communicate this plan, and then cooperate in big groups. And this cooperation in big groups meant that these early people conquered the globe. They obliterated, in many ways, all the other hominid species, so Neanderthals and all the other guys had to go, unfortunately, because these people here had this powerful tool, the tool of language, and ultimately the tool of abstraction. Right there it started. The ability to abstract is the starting point of everything. And if you think about it, cities in the end are nothing else than an abstraction of nature. Right? They are a manipulation of nature so that it works for us, the humans, rather than for anything else. Right? This ability somehow is located right here and is only 60,000 years old. So if you now try to think about this a bit more abstractly, so that we have tools then to understand how we work, to understand how we cooperate and how we function, and therefore to understand also what cities are, because cities in the end are built in the image of us human beings, then we can maybe think about these three concepts. So we have interactions, we have transactions, and we have organization. Extremely simple. Interaction is basically what we do now, right? I tell you certain things, I wave my hands, and you somehow listen to me, and my words generate images in your head, right? And you all sit here, and you listen to me. You don't run and get your bananas like other primates, or you don't lose interest and do something else, because somehow there's a certain custom on how we interact, right? There's a certain way of doing things and a certain belief from you that the words I'm speaking are somehow meaningful and they enter your brain and do something, right? That's interaction. And that generates a certain resonance, right? So we resonate now. There's something happening here. The next thing is transactions. That's what we do later, right? We eat and drink. You sit on chairs which have been produced somewhere. You work with cameras which have been produced in Asia. That's all about transactions, the manipulation of materials, of goods, of food, of energy, everything we need to have a materially functioning life. And the last thing then is organization. That's the magic, basically, which allows us to cooperate. That's the reason why you listen to me. That's why the relationship we have right now is somewhat stable, right? There is a certain stability in what we do. Again, you don't run away and do something else. So this is if you look at cities, in the end, you can abstract the city and I understand cities as these three things. You just need to look exactly enough. Because what interaction does, it allows us to generate social difference, social differentiation. It allows us to be listeners and talkers, photographers and audience, bartenders and dancers, right? Differentiation allows exchange, because I'm different from you, I can tell you something you didn't know yet. That allows society, culture, and in the end innovation, right? Because something happens here. When you look at transaction, then we divide work. Again, we have the photographer, we have the talker. The division of work allows value chains, markets, and economy, which in the end allows us to add value, to make things which are more valuable than they were before, because we manipulate these products somehow. And in the end, we have organization, which is about control, redistribution, institution, civilization, and of course, in the end, stability. So that's in the end what makes us tick, and in the end, what makes cities work. What then happened somehow is that since the earliest cities, we took these three principles and we were just speeding them up and making them more virtual. So speeding up means language turned to writing, writing turned to telecommunication, telecommunication turned to digitalization. It's just more and more speed and more and more reach. So we are now able to send an image from here right to the other side of the globe. Transactions, we have trade, we then have infrastructure, so huge railroads, highways, we have machines, and ultimately industrialization, which allows us to manipulate matter in more and more effective ways. And of course, in organization, we have religion, which is a kind of a technology to be close together and still like each other, right? To have a story about a certain family relationship, even so we don't have it, but religion is a very good story to give us that. There is money, which allows kind of a clear transactional values. There's ideology, and of course there's media. So this is kind of the glue which ties us together. So we have virtualization, globalization, and universalization, which all originated in this social reactor called cities, and now spread over the globe. But what it also means is that the more open the system is, the more permeable the system is. Again, think back to Zipf law, right? The more easy it is to generate difference. The more easy it is to have few who have a lot and a lot who have little, right? The bigger the market is you're in, the more extreme inequality will be. And again, that's not good or bad. That's simply a kind of almost like mathematics. Accumulation, therefore, means difference, and difference means resentment, and potentially at some point fragmentation. So what we are facing right now is not really any more globalization in my eyes, but some sort of a mix between virtualization, where all of power being, of course, accumulated in the Silicon Valley, for example, and on the other hand, fragmentation, kind of a relocalization of a lot of culture, a lot of stories, and a lot of ideologies and religions, of course. Now let's take this thought experiment and let's just play it out. So we have a little algorithm which we produced, so let's see whether it works. So this is a city, right? A city protects exchange, it controls resource flows, it takes services and goods go out, resources, goods and people go into the city, again, interaction, transaction, culture, economy, social differentiation, value chains, division of work. That's a kind of a city kernel, kind of the simple most algorithm of what a city is doing. Cities then, let's say this is an early city, this is an early trade route. At some point it makes then sense that in this periphery another small city is starting, right? Because you can say, well, if all this obsidian is going into a particular place, or if all of this wheat is going in a particular place, why don't we add a bit of value before we send it there? And then I have a little city here, and this city starts to be more and more smart, right? More and more it does what central cities do, it does it too. It will have traders, it will have lawyers, it will have merchants, and it gets more and more independent and mature. And throughout all of urban history, these cores many times disappeared for whatever reason. And then this peripheral city took over. A very good example of this is, for example, Knossos. You know, you all know Crete, the Minoan culture, I think, right, where around 1600 before Christ, there was this amazing culture with big ships and where people were jumping across buffaloes, right? And these big ships, of course, were quite expensive to build. It was not so easy, right? And because they had to control all the resource flows in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the Minoans basically took all of the trees on Crete away, right? They cut down all the trees, of course rendering their island fairly ecologically unstable, and they had to start to import trees, right? And they started to import trees from here, from Mycenae, just exactly north, right? And Mycenae, at first probably kind of a small little village of timber people and a couple of fishermen, started to send them these trees, and fantastic. I mean, the Minoans want trees, good. They pay us in nice wine and pottery and so on. And when then Knossos collapsed, when the Minoan culture collapsed, Mycenae took over and became the ruling power in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. So that means that from Mesopotamia I have this kind of urban relay, right, like in a relay run in the Olympics, where basically the city generates another city, generates another city, generates another city. So from Uruk and Ur, you go to all these places until you end up in Europe, until you end up in the United States, or from Harappa in India, you went all the way until you end up in China and so on, right? And it's almost like a chemical reaction. A city generates another city because an urban system wants another urban system to interact with. These generated cities we still know, cities which survived, like Rome. It also generated cities which are completely forgotten, like Angkor Wat, which was an immensely interesting hydrological culture in the 12th century in the 12th century after the birth of Christ, which is now completely disappeared. And what empires were, in some ways, colonial empires, is basically vertically integrated supply chains. So it's the same system, but it's just organized into different kind of silos. And the Cold War, in the end, was basically this. You had one city system and another city system divided by the Iron Curtain, which was a bit permeable, right? But still, there was a division and an idea that these two different systems were the same. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, what we have today, of course, is not anymore separate systems, which are still kind of not connected, but we have one big global culture with almost no exception, where everybody trades with everything and everything is connected with everybody else. And that generates huge peaks, and on the other hand, huge devastation, right? And that's, again, that's not in itself good or bad, it's just a fact of this kind of urban system running its course. So summary, this is kind of a summary of the first third of the lecture, right? What's the summary? Well, cities are like social reactors, right? They're like a nuclear engine, and they allow people to be together, to interact, to transact, to have ideas, and with these ideas to make bigger cities, to expand, to make empires, to conquer the world, to connect and trade with other cities, right? Cities are social reactors, and in the end, they make us humans into social beings. And proximity in space and time allow for interaction, transaction, for culture, markets, for innovating, adding value, and for accumulation. Cities are also collective tools to create location factors. That sounds a bit special, but it simply means cities are built for people, and people are willing to pay for locations when they like this location, and that, of course, results in people who can afford this location and other people who cannot afford the location. So that means the result is the difference and inequality. There are winners and losers, and those who have will get more. So in my eyes, cities are not necessarily sustainable, right? Temporary stability, however, is achieved through narratives of redistribution and cooperations or limits to growth. So meaning, if we let cities just be cities, humans just be humans, then there will be inequality and it will be unfair. Meaning, equality requires political will. It requires good institutions. It requires the desire of fairness. Okay, so how do I, as an architect, react to all of that? What does this really mean for me? Well, the difficulty, of course, of dealing with cities is what we experience now, right? There's noise, it's hard to focus, especially when you work on city building. It's confusing because you have huge machines doing things and it's hard to control everything. You know, a kind of a fog of war. And it's not always easy to think what a city can be. This is us visiting the Hafen city during the competition introduction. But then, at some point, when all people cooperate and planning actually functions, you start to understand what a city, what an urban area can be, and you are able to produce these types of models of the future. So on top, you have the city center of Hamburg. What you have down here is the Hafen city, so this new harbor development of Hamburg. And this piece down here is an urban design competition which we have won, which I want to explain quickly. This is the view in the other direction of the Hafen city development. And this in front here is the Elbphilharmonie by Herzog de Meuron. So we are exactly, with our project, exactly on the other hand, on the other side of a Herzog de Meuron. And this Hafen city project happened incredibly quickly. So this is 1997. This is 10 years later. And this is today, you know, on this barren harbor land, now this new city emerged with a lot of people coming, tourists and also locals, with large pieces of infrastructure. So this is the subway, which is already pre-built, which is now the starting point for the rest of the urban development, and a lot of very impressive facts. So what is especially interesting is that the urban area of Hamburg is now expanded by 40%. So what's the idea of our competition entry, which is this part here? It's at the end of Hafen city, right next to the metro station. And this is the current situation right now. So the roads are already being built because they need to settle. So you need to build them early and then compact the earth. What you see next to the road is basically the basement of the buildings adjacent to it. And at some point, this place should look like this. The first buildings are already going into competition phase right now. And you see here a kind of a city which is organized in different courtyards, organized around the Balkenhafen, this kind of a harbor place in the middle, and with high points and kind of blockrand, perimeter block areas. So what's now the idea here? So when you build a city, in order to generate something which is more stable than a city where people cannot appropriate space and where local neighborhoods cannot form. The idea here is that we organize the city around these many portals which act as gates, which structure the space, like this, for example, where you look from one space into another space, and these spaces are differentiated into local areas of publicness, semi-publicness, and more intimate areas. So you see that here quite nicely. So we have in orange very public areas, kind of still public but not so highly frequented. Here this is already more for the neighborhood. There's a little bit of a privacy moment. So this is a kind of a neighborhood terrace where you can look out into the harbor. And then this is a fairly private area which should serve this particular block here. All of these blocks are connected through passages, and you have at the end always moments where you have more frequency than in these parts here. So instead of making a city which is kind of universal, where everything is accessible in the same way, we make a city which is nested, which has moments which are very intimate, moments which are a bit less intimate, and moments which are really public, where you can have a lot of exchange also with strangers. This is then how it looks in plan, and we have a big square in it. The access from the metro station will be very good. So this is one lesson, which is that one of the answers an architect can give to this danger of inequality and of kind of too much permeability is well-structured space, well-organized space, space which is kind of fractally nested together in a way where you generate layers of publicness and layers of intimacy, so that you don't just add square meters, you add quality of life. Another competition which we just won yesterday actually is just south of it. So up here you have Hafen City. This is the center of Hamburg. And we now go to Wilhelmsburg, which is at this point here. Wilhelmsburg is basically on a huge island which is surrounded by the river Elbe. It's a place which is very different from Hafen City. It's a project also which is very different. So because where in Hafen City there was basically nothing anymore, here we have already part of a city which was flooded in 1962, so that's why development stopped. We have a city which already works, and we have a landscape which is incredibly nice actually, which functions as a big structure. We have also a landscape which works as property with all of these little allotment gardens. We have landscape where a lot of people already have very good lives in it, where people have a high quality of life, personal little spaces, and somehow we need to deal with this. Currently there is still this Reichsstraße going through, so a big highway with 4 lanes, which separates a commercial industrial area from a kind of allotment garden area, and these kind of blocks on the other side of the canal. So our most important strategy is to basically integrate landscape and city in a way to make this new city work with the quality which is already here, rather than destroy everything and try to build identity newly. We work with the identity which is already on location. This, by the way, means also that we take this street here, which will be moved. That's what allows for this urban development to happen. This street is actually running here right now, and will be moved to about this area. But we use this old street figure almost like a sunken Roman road to organize again paths and networks around it. So this is then the urban plan. So you see here in this area is this old highway which kind of travels through all the way. We have in front the allotment gardens, we have here the schools, the neighborhood square, and then a series of blocks which are fairly open towards the green, and up there the kind of the production area. So a lot of quality for public life, differentiated landscape with sports, with playgrounds, with a park, with a garden area, and then down here the allotment gardens, and a kind of a neighborhood square and a neighborhood area here in the middle. So the idea to really give this particular place a heart which actually functions for the people, to give the entire area a structure which works with the already existing structure and the existing nature, and at the same time leave a lot of the existing property situations intact, so that these two systems, old and new, can grow together. So here you see the competition entry, a big axon, a kind of view into the city with the rowing club which exists, with the two new schools, the green band, the kind of the public park which has an access to the canal which will be ecologically differentiated here, a kind of a hard area with a bit of commercial space. Then down here this kind of movement from allotment gardens to the bike loop to the old road which turned into a housing road, to more blocks, and then in the end we have the production areas. The production areas of course generate a lot of noise. That's why this band of buildings needs to act as a kind of a noise protection for the area behind it. So even so, this structure is fairly differentiated, but also, let's say, fairly clear. Inside it, we have many different kind of building types, property opportunities, price levels. So there will be property which you can buy, you can rent. There are subsidized areas. There are collective building possibilities, and so on. So it's very mixed. The idea is to generate a city which is very mixed, which is almost like a hummus, almost like a garden in which it, of course, is also located. So these are two kind of urban areas, but cities, of course, are not always just areas you can so easily understand and control. Cities grow out and have long since left the boundaries of the old city walls. This is an early plan of Hamburg from 1909 by Fritz Schumacher. We were working again on the Hafen City here and on Wilhelmsburg, this island here. Also for London is in the case of London, there's a very famous plan by Arthur Ling and D.K. Johnson in 1943, which also understands the city as a kind of a biotope, as a kind of a mix of many different things, right? Because the differentiation of this and the idea that in all of these little points you can have value, you can have good lives and so on, is exactly the thing which protects us from cities which are too unequal and too unfair. Right? The aim needs to be to make every little one of these bubbles work with its own story, with its own identity, its own people, and its own little markets and communities. So the image of the European city, however, prevents us to think this well, to think clearly, because the image of the European city, very much still in the head of architects, is still the image with a city with these old walls around it, right, which is clear as a form, which you can understand and you can architecturalize it, you can understand it as an architect, right? Rossi wrote a book, The Architecture of the City, and I think that's a nice idea, but it's actually also a very dangerous idea because it makes us think the city too hard, right, too structured and not organic enough, not enough like a landscape. The image of the city, of course, is not even anymore a city which grew beyond the old city walls, as in the case of Zurich. But the image of the city, it should be actually today this. This is the reality of the European city. And of course it's also the reality of Moscow, like a city which is sprawling beyond the horizon, a city which you don't understand anymore as a little thing which you can look at and say, this is the city with its walls and its doors and I understand as an architect. No, you have to understand a city almost like an ecology. And I want to show you a project where we try to do that. If you think about a city and the idea that in a city there should be interaction, transaction, organization, then of course you can generate interaction and transaction also by transport, right? And the more powerful transport is, the bigger the city spreads out, right? So cities can be really sprawling because we have such powerful transport infrastructures. And in the case of Zurich, it means that all of these people in all of these areas in pink signify areas where people commute into Zurich to work. And this kind of organic thing with very dynamic boundaries is also connected again in many different ways beyond its boundaries to other areas in Switzerland and of course also other areas in the world. And this area which you just saw before is therefore part of an even bigger kind of area of connections, interactions and transactions, right? So again, we saw that this kind of nestedness of spaces in the area of, for example, Hamburg in our project, right, where it was all about nesting and putting things into each other so that people feel comfortable. But in many ways, the same is true also on a much bigger scale, that things are in relationships across many different scales in many different ways. If you try to define this area of Zurich, then you can take different definitions and end up in the end with something like this. And this is the image which we then drew of this place. This is kind of our idea of this biotope called Zurich, of this organism called Zurich. And this map is actually fairly structured, it's almost scientific, but what it means basically is that we can look at this city almost like we can look at this biotope. And we call this image which we made Standort mosaic, which means mosaic of location, which is a term from plant sociology and means that in different locations different kinds of plants exist, but when you take all of these locations together, then you have a biotope which is something like this. For example, here you have an old piece of wood which is like really old money, right? You don't have skyscrapers on it, but you have a lot of growth, it's nicely green, and you have lots of old ladies who drink tea, right there, they're living here. You have here areas where you cannot build because there's too much water. Then you have here a couple of high-rises which come out. Then you have here even bigger high-rises in the outskirts. But they're all organized by the location factors which this biotope has to offer. And the city in the end is nothing else. It's just made very much also by people. So when we go into this kind of location mosaic, then we can, we're defining it with these three layers. We have a layer of structure, which is mainly infrastructure. We have a layer of Gestalt, which is all about identity and small little neighborhoods. And we have here the layer of form, which is what architects mostly misunderstand as urbanism. Form means, for example, this space. Form means the seven sisters, the Stalin skyscrapers, right? That's things you can name, things you can see. So this is a structure which is basically turning this kind of territory of unconnected little cities into that which is in the end functioning as a polycentric urban region. We have the Gestalt, which are a lot of little villages which happened historically, which are connected and given chances and accessibility through traffic demand. So you have here accessibility by private car, and you have here accessibility by public transport. So you see very well here that Zurich is a city which is organized around an S-Bahn system, so a train system, right? So cars basically spread out equally, they're like omelets. But when you have a train system, then you have accessibility points around the station, so you have a polynuclear growth of the city. And of course, you also have politics, which is organized very much along urban structure, so left in the middle, liberal at the outskirts, and conservative right-wing at the edge, and in the end you have form. And if you put all of that together, you get this, and you can zoom into this, and you see how this organism is organized, and you can also zoom into it even more, and then see how form, identity, and this deep structure overlays. So the point is, when you look at Moscow, right, like this, also in Moscow you will see these layers. You see small little kernels which were once little villages which were grown around where Moscow grew around. You see buildings which organize space, and you see these big lines of the metros and the metro stations which feed accessibility and allow certain high-rise clusters all of a sudden to emerge out of the city's ground. Our thinking is, if we understand a city like that, then we can much better think about strategies to work with particular parts of the city. For example, this we look at as the heart chamber of the metropolitan region of Zurich. And this is Zurich downtown. So Zurich as an administrative region, but the argument is, of course, that Zurich without its periphery would never be able to compete in a global market, right? It would be completely alone, completely useless, not very powerful, very small. There are about 370,000 people living in here right now. The full functional region of Zurich is much bigger. And depending on where you are in this particular mosaic, right, in this particular ecology, you need to react very differently as an architect. This, for example, is a building which is at the center, you know, where it's about mixed use, it's about height, it's about the idea to generate diversity, where you can have good lives for many people. And this is a train station which is much more peripheral. So the idea here is to prevent a loss of identity and prevent all smart people leaving from this city by a kind of a good train station which allows you to commute well, allows the city to have an identity, and therefore to resist this suction power of the large center like Zurich and give this particular place more uniqueness. So this is the situation today. It's Herisau, it's in the Appenzell, a very small little point where, however, two train lines come together. It has been historically built into this cliff. So about 100 years ago, people cut down this entire hill, leveled it out, and built this new station there. On the other side, you have this green. And here we developed, on the one hand, a kind of an urban plan where we have here kind of this wall of buildings mirroring the wall of the cliff and allowing this kind of biotope in the middle. So here we have one train line, here the other train line. And in the middle of this middle band, we then have this large roof, which basically organizes all of the commuter relations. So the link between train and train, the link between train and bus, and of course also the link between the station and the city. So you see here again the cliffside, the buildings which mirror the cliff, these buildings which sit in between, and the open spaces which sit in between, and here this building which makes the access to the station more easy. So again, the important thing to generate connectivity and accessibility. And this is the roof currently in the preliminary design phase, which we work on with Jörg Gonzett. It's a very large structure which serves for all the buses and also the trains, and hopefully will be nice. It's a concrete wood hybrid structure, so basically where the wood has tensile properties. And this is a kind of a bridge which then links up together with the elevator to the upper plateau and the city at large. Now, this is another question in this biotope. How can we make this biotope able to still produce, you know, to not lose its industry, but let the industry somehow survive inside the city? This is the biggest white goods producer in Switzerland, so they produce washing machines, ovens, and so on, in the center of the city of Zug. Earlier they were in the outskirts, but of course Zug grew around it. This is a big Hochregallager. This is the production area. And the client basically wants to turn this image into that image, because they want to achieve three things. They want to make production more effective, so double the output on half the square meters. This is what we are trying to achieve in this stacked industrial space up there. Secondly, they know that they're not only not productive enough, they know that they're also not innovative enough, so they want to add other companies, like other headquarters, but also other productive and research facilities for companies. And thirdly, they want to let the city into the formerly closed industrial area. So we have here the two main axes in Zug. We link the axis with an urban square here, and we develop this area here with a system of little alleys and squares which allow people in the city access to it. And here we are again able to produce a little biotope. We are again able to mix and link and put things together with these different types of uses. So you have here always a housing tower and an office tower sitting on a plinth of production. Could look, for example, like this. It's still an urban design, so it will have to change architecturally a bit. But this is the dream, the idea that you are in a place where you still have production, where you have facilities for the industrial staff, where you have small stores, where you have startups and offices, where you have offices for larger partners, where you have living areas, and where you have a look into the landscape and to this big mountain at the very end of this alley. And also here the idea is that it's very public in the city, kind of half public inside the neighborhood, not so public, more intimate here in the courtyard so that kids can play here. This is already fairly private, a roof terrace, and then you go up to the loggias where you again have more privacy. And all of this, of course, needs to happen in time. So we start with this, we cut out the public space, and then we build step by step, we build this city into the former industry. This is the first building we are working on, the headquarters for Zug, so a new industrial area, a new production facility, a new tower. Can work like this in the existing halls. With all the flows which we need to organize, and the ability to make a montage floor, so a place where people put the machines together, which is extremely filled with light, where people can look in and see what happens, where also the technicians always have an idea whether the production floor runs well or does not run well. Then this I do a bit more quickly. This again is an idea on how can you make this biotope, this standard mosaic, how can you enable to be innovative, how can you keep it intelligent. So the idea here is to take this old military airport and turn it into an innovation park. That's also a competition which we won. The idea, of course, to bring people and resources together, embed it in a culture and make it able to collaborate and to cooperate in many ways. Here the big question was, how can you embed a kind of an innovation campus which necessarily needs to be about a lot of exchange, a lot of interaction. How can you embed that into the suburbs? So the idea is to have one level of intervention, which is this kind of big road, which is a kind of a regional intervention. It's visible as a big kind of figure on the ground. We have these windows where the city can look into the very large open space of the airport. So one time here, one time here. We have a kind of a street which leads in, which is even more dense, and again these little courtyards which allow even more density. So here the kind of the parkway, left innovation park, on the right hand the big open space. Here again this idea of fractality. We have here these different kind of production areas. Here the innovation mall, very dense, very much organized around people walking, so human scale is extremely important, and the idea of having kind of shop windows of innovation on all sides. Here a kind of an access to culture also, and here hopefully the final result in 2 versions, which gives you an idea on how, even so we are in the suburbs, we can still generate density and a kind of an urban intensity, and still, however, give people access to the big view. A similar idea we had for a building, so now this is a building scale where again we are trying to work with this idea of fractal space, of organizing space in many ways. Here the kind of the stack of different functions of commerce, of a school, and of housing, with many levels of green, with a kind of many ways of using this space formally and informally. So these are formal classrooms, and these are kind of informal kind of working areas, organized here along this section where you can kind of walk up and always look into different types of spaces. And this as a kind of a final result. This is a competition which we did not win. Unfortunately, we are not allowed to build this, which is very sad. But it gives you an idea that this idea of making different spaces, organizing and structuring spaces well, works for cities, but it also works, of course, in buildings. So what's the kind of conclusion of how to make better cities? Well, we saw that cities create accessibility in space and time on many scales, and all of these scales, whether it be buildings, whether it be urban areas like in Hamburg, or whether it be entire kind of city areas like in the metro belt of Zurich, all of these scales need to be aligned correctly, right? So that at the right moments we have a lot of people, a lot of intensity, and a lot of kind of action happening, while in other places it's not so intense and people can live a kind of a private life. And human scale, these fractal layers of intimacy and public levelness are extremely important. We need to integrate with nature and urban ecology. We need to redistribute and prevent inequality, and we need to generate local narratives. That's what we are trying to do in these different projects. Now the last section is, okay, how do we make cities better? There are certain strategies, but what we saw in the very beginning is that we might enter a kind of a phase of fragmentation, a phase of change, which is maybe not so easy. So how do we make these cities last? Like, what do we do so that not all of a sudden they kind of crumble and don't function anymore? When you look at Switzerland, then you see these urban areas. This is the urban area we looked at before, like the area of Zurich, and you see other urban areas, but you also see large part of the city which don't work in an urban way, which function very differently. That generates 2 problems. On the one hand, the urban areas are not anymore aligned with the administrative units, so the old system of cantons doesn't really function anymore, because all of the kind of functional city regions completely grew beyond the old boundaries. So there's a kind of a big disconnect between what politicians do, what administrations do, and what the city actually has become in the meantime. On the other hand, we also have a big problem. What's the difference between landscape and cities? So what do people who live here have in terms of opportunities and chances compared to people who live here? You know, how can we prevent this type of inequality on a national level? And how can we do that in a time where we have global urbanization, where we have a lot of change and a lot of unpredictability? So this is a kind of a series of talks which we organized. This is what has been mentioned earlier. It was not really a pavilion in the Biennale, it was only a kind of a collateral event, but the collateral event was titled The Next 100 Years Scenarios for an Alpine City-State. So it dealt with Switzerland in the future in an urban volatile world, and over the next 100 years. And 100 years basically means you cannot extrapolate the present, right? You cannot claim, well, the next 100 years will be like today. There will be change, there will be transformation, which means the future becomes something which requires political will, right? It requires a vision because you don't know what will happen. You have to think what could happen and you have to react with it in terms of political will. We organized this in Venice, of course, which was a city-state which also had a trajectory which went from being nothing to being incredibly powerful to now just being a museum for kind of biennial events. We organized it also in the consulate of Switzerland, so right next to the political Switzerland, and we organized it around our constitution. So this is the constitution which the Swiss people wrote in 1848, which is still one of the smartest documents which we ever did. And we basically asked the question, space and spatial politics, the issue of inequality and the issue of transformation is hugely discussed in the population. It's a huge political discussion in Switzerland right now, but currently architects don't have a clear opinion around it and don't have a really clear stance vis-a-vis it. So we made a kind of a series of events which was introduced by one of our ministers, Federal Councillor Alain Berset, where a lot of people came to listen, where a lot of architects gave their inputs. But after that we banned the architects and rather talked to science fiction writers. Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote a very well-known trilogy about terraforming Mars and what that means for human society evolving on the face of this planet, and by doing that, of course, changing the face of the planet, right? It was a kind of a little lab experiment which he did with these 3 books. We talked with urban geographers and complex system scientists, with activists, with architects, with lobbyists and politicians, and in the end we made a kind of a final assembly where, like in a good old Swiss tradition, we voted on outcomes, so what actually are the problems and how are we going to solve them. It was a great experiment, fairly complex, but it had a couple of interesting results. First result basically was that, what I already said before, that administrative and functional region relationships do not correlate anymore, that sovereignty and subsidiarity need to be rebalanced. Sovereignty basically means, am I in control of my city? Am I in control of my nation? And as we have seen in the case of Brexit just a week and a half ago, a lot of people are really worried about sovereignty. They are really worried about whether a nation still is in control of its own territory and its own economy. And of course, in many ways we are not, right? Because we do live, in fact, in a global society. So the question is very much who controls what and with what legitimacy. Is a nation state still the best model for it, or should we think about something new? Should we think rather in city-states? Should we have a kind of a Russia which does one thing and a kind of a city-state Moscow which behaves very differently? Should London be part of the EU but Great Britain not? I mean, maybe that would be a lot more convenient, right? So there are questions coming up which are not easy to solve, but we should be able to discuss them. In order to discuss them, we need the ability to generate new stories, right? We cannot only think about horrible science fiction or old nostalgic myths about the great empire we once were in the case of England, or also in the case of the former Soviet Union. We need to think in new stories, but what can these new stories be? How can we think about the future in a good way? And most importantly, of course, for the people involved, how can we create local narratives, right? How can we create local narratives which tie people in a particular location together in a new way? Of course, not being made easier by the fact that we live in an urban, volatile, interconnected and ecologically challenged planet. What are the kind of stories we want to tell each other for the future? This is also a project which we have won, and it's basically in the tradition of the Swiss national exhibitions. You know, Switzerland is a nation by will and common sense, not so much a nation by history, right? We never had a grand history like France or like England. We were always a bit boring peasants. And in the end, our history was very much, our nation state was very much forced upon us by the Viennese Congress after the First World War, after the collapse of the French Empire. And we somehow always have to rethink, who are we and why are we a nation and what should we do with this nation. And the Swiss National Exhibitions were an incredibly good tool for that. There was a very famous national exhibition in 1939, of course, right at the onset of the Second World War, where Switzerland had a real problem with Germany and had to think, are we like the Germans or are we different? The national exhibitions helped us to think, no, we are actually different, we are unique, we are smaller, we are more countryside people, we don't want to join the Nazis. Then there was a next exhibition in 1964, which was all about progress, about technology, about the marvels of new infrastructure and so on. There was a kind of a really great exhibition in 2002, the Expo 02, which was all about creativity, culture and the arts, and Switzerland now becoming globally more visible with projects by Coop Himmelblau or this cloud project, which you might have seen by Dilo Scofidio. And the question was now, what could a concept for a national exhibition be in 2027? And what we did is the expedition 2027, 3 landscapes, 2 worlds, 1 adventure. And interestingly enough, this exhibition will happen right here in this empty area here, where the urban area of Zurich meets the hinterland of St. Gallen, Thurgau and Appenzell, right, where really we are at this negotiation border between an urban system and a non-urban system, and somehow we needed to find a story for these types of identities and what we could do there. And the interesting thing is that this area is very beautiful in terms of its landscape. It has a kind of a lake landscape, an urban landscape and a mountain landscape. So this is the lake looking from Germany towards Switzerland and Austria. These are the mountains. This is looking down from the highest mountains there. This is looking towards the highest mountains there, towards the Sentis. And this is the city of St. Gallen and its agglomeration. Here is the old monastery of St. Gallen, which was active already 1000 after Christ, controlled large parts of eastern Switzerland, southern Germany and Austria. And then, of course, you also see the suburbs which grew around it. And in the back, again, you see the Sentis, the highest mountain in the region. And onto this landscape, we project 3 questions. Where are we coming from? Who are we? And where are we heading? So that these 3 landscapes turn like into 3 scenes on one large stage. 3 scenes, all with different atmospheres and different questions. So this is very much the question, where do we come from? The Alps being part of the African continent, of course, which were folded up, kind of pushed together and turned now into the peaks we know today. This is the question, who are we? Of course, a kind of a mix between the symbolism of the old monastery church in St. Gallen and the infrastructure which brings us together, kind of symbols and infrastructure producing the culture of today. And this is all about the future, so looking to the other coast, looking to the other nations around us, sort of seeing to what the future will come. So the idea is that the Expedition 27, so the next Expo, is not just a topic, it will not just have the future as a topic, as a kind of a label on a pavilion, but the future of this particular landscape is very much the concrete aim of this exhibition. And with the mobilization power of implementing this expedition, we believed we could jump over some political and planning hurdles which we normally would have. So the idea was to basically turn the entire landscape into a big adventure map where we could lift up and understand the territory in a kind of a new way. And we would logistically access the landscape by these 3 large railroad rings, which would act as kind of narrative threads. 1 railroad ring along the coast, 1 railroad ring along the mountain, and 1 railroad ring along the city kind of landscape in between, here St. Gallen, here the Rhine Valley. All of that, of course, worked out with Swiss precision in terms of capacities which we have on the railroad lines, and the ability of these 3 rings to work together and also to connect to the rest of Switzerland and the world. This was an idea of having a planning office very early, kind of moving around from municipality to municipality, planning out this adventure. And the trains in general should act as kind of rolling narrators and exhibition pavilions, kind of running through the landscape and making it accessible. So these 3 landscapes are connected together. We just quickly go through. This is the lake region, and we have always an idea of a kind of a larger planning strategy and a smaller intervention. This is the planning strategy that we want to kind of increase the quality of the entire lakefront and have a kind of a focus here in Romanshorn, allowing the harbor to develop in new ways with these kinds of topics. You know, kind of cargo cult, Moby Dick, future technologies, kind of beauties coming out of the lake, kind of spy technology, so all sorts of things which have to do with the future, with the technological, with the unforeseen, and maybe also the transcendental, symbolized by a kind of a floating island here on the right. Then the urban landscape is all about connecting people. It's all around, organized around this big crossing, a crossing which links the main infrastructural lines which run through Switzerland, and a kind of a point in which to also improve the quality of the agglomeration of St. Gallen. It's an old industrial area, very much like here, the chocolate factory. The idea would be to build a big roof which connects the highway with the big train station. A roof then where spaces can also be used in adjacent parts, on the one hand here in factory areas, but also here in the big soccer stadium. And it can also spread out all the way along the highway, maybe even the Kantonstrasse, the Cantonal Street, maybe even the highway. And from here you would be able to take a kind of a little cable car to go then to meet the other railroad rings. And the crossing would be all about a big market hall, about spectacle, kind of road, eating on the road, a big control room. So it will be all about who are we, how do we connect, how do we politically structure our life, and how do we interact with other people. And in the end, the kind of alpine landscape, of course, is a point where we will not have a lot of capacity, so we cannot bring a lot of people up there. So we need to have much smaller points, but maybe more of them. So here we follow a kind of an old tradition of these dancing floors, temporary floors, which you built in order to have a party for a week, and then you would take the floor away. These dancing floors we would build temporarily in these different locations, always with a view contact to the hill of Sentis, and also always connected again to the railroad ring. And here we would ponder questions like, where do we come from, what is nature, cosmological questions, religious questions, questions of transcendentality, and of course also small architectural interventions which in the end could become part of a tourism kind of program. And the idea would be that this expedition starts soon and allows us to reconnect the people of this region again with symbolism and infrastructure in new ways. Unfortunately, of course, the people didn't like the idea. They voted it down about 2 weeks ago. So we now see whether in other areas of Switzerland we can find a new place for this. It's hard to work against fragmentation when people don't want to do that with you. What are the conclusions? I think we need a scientific way to understand cities. a human way to design them, and great skill to communicate the necessary measures. Communication, in the end, is one of the absolute key skills which we need to have, because a lot of people are very angry because inequality generates resentment, and in order to overcome this resentment, you need to communicate really well. And for this communication to work, we need narratives that are locally anchored, that are coming from the people also, but they're still hopefully somewhat global in outlook. They're authentic in their ambition and socially inclusive. And architects, I believe, can have a role if they somehow balance leadership, but also accept a lot of local participation. A lot of these urban design projects and a lot of these transformation projects are completely unthinkable if you don't have the people behind you. So you need to really balance both. You need to balance what you want, but respectively what your client wants in the end, right? As an architect, you're just a service provider. But the absolute key thing is local participation. Without that, you cannot achieve anything. And for this, we need knowledge, tools, and trust. And the absolute key thing, of course, which a lot of us lack right now, because also we are part of the commercial system, is trust. How can we get trust? And yes, with that, I'm at the end, and I hope you trust that I told you at least what I honestly think. Thank you.
Translator, because some questions
Yeah.
Маркус, спасибо большое. Спасибо вам, дорогие друзья, что, несмотря на внешние помехи, вы услышали и с таким интересом следили за происходящим. Если у вас есть какие-то вопросы, можно поднять руку, вы получите микрофон и зададите свой вопрос. Вопрос есть прямо на первом ряду, можно далеко не ходить.
In Russian or English?
English, it would be very nice.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it was very cool ecological system of startup spaces, because I did in Moscow startup place for makers, and it was interesting. I have two questions. First, that I think that urbanistic is not only about Hamburg or Moscow, but also about small cities. We can do there better than big cities. You know that in Russian politician and economic situation, our town's province is dying. I think that if they will do favorable conditions, they can, from domestic, grow up economical and with culture. And give please three your simple advice points what Russians should do with the small beautiful old cities, how we should find solves. This first question, and I have twice. I have friend politician and health wellness activist, and we have draft law about real estate and workout sport courts. What's you think about workout in the cities, in ecosystem culture? Maybe you can advise books or authors who write about it. Thank you.
Workout in cities.
Yeah.
Okay. So two questions. Let me answer the first one. I mean, in terms of small cities, there are two developments now, and again, it has a lot to do with this problem of inequality, right? According to McKinsey, the biggest growth in urbanism right now is happening in these beta cities, and there are about 600 of these small cities, so 1 million and a bit above, which grow immensely right now. A lot of them are in China, some of them are in India and other places in the world. And those cities, you know, they have economic potential, they develop, they're usually, again, like we saw earlier, they are attached to bigger cities which they serve with kind of goods and so on. And those cities, they function well. There you just need to make sure they don't go corrupt. Right there, corruption is the biggest problem. There are, however, cities which are the losers of globalization, and that's incredibly difficult. There are cities who, in economies which had smaller networks, were once very important. You know, Herisau, the train station I showed you with the big roof, this city was once an incredibly important industrial city. They were able to basically enforce their own rail line towards the Gotthard. They had that much power and money. But now they're not so important anymore. There's a lot of migration. People are either old or foreigners. And in these cities, we now work quite often, actually. And there, this issue of local narratives is really key. And as architects, the best way to generate local narratives is with projects, but projects where people are really also involved, you know, where the people of the village and of the city see these projects as their own projects, they participate in it, they see themselves in it, and you're able to kind of link what's fragmented back into something which is more or less functioning. So we have Herisau is one project where we work with a kind of infrastructural intervention. We are working now in Solingen, kind of a former industrial area in Germany, which is also deindustrializing. And there we're trying to link people in an exact situation like this. So Strelko is actually one of the best examples. So you need to generate local projects, include the people, get a bit of money maybe from the government, and be present. And what we also see in Japan a lot is that a lot of young architects, they do what they call machitsukuri. So machitsukuri means town making, and town making very much means getting people together, give them a vision, and then collaborate with them to get this vision to be true. And when I think about what we do, I very much think that we should generate a lot of little life rafts, right? Little boats, little arkanoas, where also small cities have an idea of what they are about, so that they can survive a future which might be not as nice as it is now. So this life raft building is something which I think will be key. Then the workout thing, actually, I don't know so much about it, and maybe we can discuss this afterwards individually during the party. But of course, what is visible right now is that cities, in fact, due to deindustrialization and due to a better understanding of infrastructure, reacquire the human scale. You see this even in Moscow now. And reacquiring human scale also means that they're accessible to our bodies again. So we can, move through them without being run over by a car. We can use them with our bikes and so on. And that will be a future which will function well, mostly because industry is leaving cities.
Mic check.
Check.
Thank you for your highly visual and very informative talk and presentation. My question concerns the size of a city. As you have shown, cities grow and generate smaller cities and then capture them and emerge into these huge biotopes. And American experience showed that this is probably not the best type of a city. When you have a small, tiny city center, which is usually deserted at night, and huge urban sprawl, and it's boring. And the opposite type of a city is classical European city. Which type of a city do you think is the ideal city of the future? The first one or the second one? Should we as architects and politicians keep this sprawl and keep ideal cities compact, or should we let it go and compensate it with a better transportation system?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That is a very good question, a very pertinent question, of course. Basically, what you need to look at is work by Jeff Kenworthy and Paul Newman. I can tell you afterwards how to find it. Because what's behind this is a very simple mechanism, which is basically form follows infrastructure. right? Cities are space-time constructs, right? That sounds strange, but it simply means that we are human beings, we're lazy, right? We don't like to travel more than 1 hour per day in order to go to a job or do whatever we do. That means that cities throughout history have always been 1 hour in diameter, about, right? In the old pedestrian cities, this 1 hour was a pedestrian hour, so it was about 3-4 kilometers. That's the cores of the European cities, right? When you then had trams and so on, the city grew a bit. It grew beyond the city boundaries. So that's when Vienna started turning down their city walls, and a lot of other European cities do that. That's because of this new technology called tram. And then you had trains where the footprint even grew more. And then you have a kind of a bifurcation. You have cities which were modernized with trains. That's like Tokyo, Hong Kong, transit-oriented cities. These cities are organized around dense centers and around a necklace, a kind of a pearl chain of very dense centers connected by trains. Tokyo is a very typical example with the Yamanote line. And you have other cities like the American cities which were modernized by cars. And cars basically spread cities out. They produce scrambled eggs, right? They make everything flat because with a car you can make point-to-point connections. And flatness is maybe not so bad, right? Because you can have a green suburb, it's okay. But the problem is also that cars are hollowing out city centers because cars consume too much space. They consume too much space traveling, right? You need big highways, look at Moscow. And they consume too much space parking, which basically generates empty urban areas, for example, in the center of Houston, which is a very good example, right? Where you have a high-rise and then huge asphalt areas just for parking lots. Now, again, when cities are about interaction, right? They're about human interaction. You need humans to be together. Now, when humans are together only in high-rises, that generates ghettos of sameness, right? Because only people working for one company are in one high-rise. But cities are then interesting when random people meet, right? And people meet randomly only in open spaces which are not dominated by cars, right? So if cities should work as cities where human exchange is happening, where you interact, where you innovate, where serendipity is possible, lucky accidents are possible, then you need cities without cars. In America it's called transit-oriented development. The new urbanists are doing this, maybe not in the best way, but that part of what they do is very smart. So I think if you want, again, if I define cities as social reactors, as places where people interact, then we need people in the cities, not cars. And that means we need the most efficient way of getting people around in cities, and that is a good public transport system. That has nothing to do with ideology. It simply has to do with the very fact that if you use all space for cars, you have no space for people. So.
Спасибо большое. Мне кажется, как продюсеру публичной программы «Стрелки», мне здесь очень хочется отметить, что это очень резонирует с проектом, который сейчас осуществляется, проектом «Моя улица», который сделало консалтинговое бюро «Стрелка» как проект, и который сейчас осуществляется, из-за которого мы все немного страдаем, но, как мы понимаем, есть смысл... Есть смысл немножко пострадать. У нас есть время ровно на один последний, короткий, хороший вопрос. Если он у кого-то есть, поднимите руку, пожалуйста. Вот, собственно, мы его нашли.
Mateusz, thanks a lot. I'm curator and I want to ask about role of arts, of public arts in urban environment, and can public art change quality of life and society? Can you say about this something, please?
No, art is a very interesting topic because I think there are two types of art nowadays, right? I think there is art, which is again all about interaction. It's all about narratives. And of course, good art stabilizes narratives, right? Good art allows a large group of people to look at an object and say, wow, that means something to us. It means something, and therefore we behave in a particular way. And it stabilizes a group of people and stabilizes interaction. And it can also be used as a project, like I said earlier. Like, you know, public art in that sense can be an amazing catalyst because it can act like a project where people rally around, they work on something together, and they discover their own identity by working on it in a collective way. So art can be one of these life rafts in a kind of an era of fragmentation. However, there's one piece of caution, because there's this other art, the commercial art, you know, the art which is basically all about a kind of an alternative currency, right? In a kind of an era of huge amounts of capital liquidity, so huge amounts of money which you need to put somewhere. Art is a kind of a good tool to store this money because it's a completely artificial system of differentiation, you know. So if a group of people says this is very valuable and everybody believes it, then it's a good idea to park some value there, right? That's a kind of an issue of art now, where art can also be highly problematic. But I think if art is honest, and if the artists are honestly working with people, then it can be amazingly valuable and amazingly beautiful also.
Thank you.
Boo.
Маркус, спасибо огромное за лекцию, было очень-очень интересно, и давайте поаплодируем, что ли. Друзья, по старой традиции, если у кого-то есть личные вопросы, то можно подойти и их задать, но берегите нашего спикера, он ночью только прилетел. Спасибо большое, всегда рад.